Hey guys, it's JJ. I know that things are crazy right now. A lot of you are practicing social distancing, and you're probably already going a little bit crazy. I'm trying to do my best to help you out during this time. I really want to help you guys get your mind off of things. So over the next handful of weeks and over the next couple of months, I'm planning on re-releasing some of the old evergreen episodes that I produced way back when the show first started. Some of them can't even be found on the Late Round Podcast feed anymore, but a lot of them are still very relevant. A lot of them can still help change the way that you think about fantasy football. So my goal is to publish one or two of them each week while you're all hanging out and staying inside. Today's archived episode is one on handcuffing. All the information in the episode pretty much still applies. Handcuffing for the sake of handcuffing is generally a bad idea. You're going to hear names in this episode that you haven't heard in a while, and that's because the episode is old. It was episode 20 of the Late Round Podcast. I talk about James Conner backing up Le'Veon Bell, for example. And by the way, this was before Le'Veon Bell ended up holding out for an entire season, so his handcuffing example wasn't exactly a normal one. But anyway, I hope you like these older episodes, and hopefully the audio isn't any worse than it typically would be. I'll be back later this week with a mailbag episode, but until then, enjoy. I've always had to help my mom with technology. Since I was a teenager, I've taught her how to access email, how to save pictures, how to store pictures, how to make folders, literally every small function that computers do and that we all do with computers, I've had to teach my mom how to do. Sometimes though, she picks up on things and she's able to learn a process on how to do whatever she's trying to do on a computer, like copying and pasting. She learned that you can right-click some text after highlighting it, click copy, and then click paste to paste that text. But when I talked to her about Command or Control C and V, it blew her mind. It was game-changing. And it was because I took an existing process that she assumed was the best process and made it into something faster and more efficient for her. I opened her eyes to something that she didn't even know existed. That's the goal here today. I'm going to talk about handcuffing your running backs in fantasy football, and the goal of this show is to have you walk away saying, man, why did I never question this process in the first place? Because people don't question the process of handcuffing enough. Handcuffing has been around forever. And for those of you who don't know what it is, which I'm sure there are 0 of you, but I'll still say this, it's the art of drafting a backup player for a player who's usually a stud you already selected to essentially have insurance if that stud player goes down with an injury. It works best with running backs because when a running back goes down, the chance that a backup running back sees a lot of work is a lot greater than a wide receiver stepping up and seeing a lot of work. Wide receiver targets usually get distributed amongst pass catchers, whereas a running back's touches will often just fall to the guy that's next in line on the depth chart. So handcuffing Ezekiel Elliott with Darren McFadden might make sense. James Conner, the now backup in Pittsburgh, to Le'Veon Bell, that's a handcuff. Jonathan Williams to LaShawn McCoy. Maybe Damian Williams for Jay Ajayi. You get the idea. A couple of years ago, handcuffing Le'Veon Bell with D'Angelo Williams really worked out. Bell tore his ACL. D'Angelo Williams stepped in and scored 8 touchdowns over the final 7 fantasy-relevant games of the season. D'Angelo Williams was a successful handcuff who won fantasy leagues. But those instances really don't happen that often at all. And I did a study on NumberFire a couple of weeks ago to show that, and I figured this could be a good forum to go over it and maybe elaborate on some of the ideas that I wrote about. So the reason people handcuff, as I said, is to sort of ensure their high running back selections. But let's just call it like it is. It's a floor play. It's not a high variance play. People are handcuffing for safety. But there are 4 main reasons why handcuffing doesn't work. So let's walk through them. The first one is that we don't always know who the handcuffs will be. Remember, we're drafting in July, August, and early September. Things will change. The guys we think will be the handcuff aren't always the handcuff. Noshawn Moreno comes to mind. He was a league winner back in 2013, but Ronnie Hillman was Monty Ball's main handcuff. And yes, Monty Ball had a handcuff. That's real life. But Hillman had a higher average draft position than Moreno did. We all thought that Hillman would be the guy, but he was not the guy. The same thing happened with Niall Davis when Jamal Charles went down a couple of years ago. It wasn't Davis who stepped up. It was Charkandrick West and Spencer Ware. So this is just a friendly reminder that we're not just wrong about player projections and which players will break out and bust, but we're wrong about depth charts. That includes the players that we would 100% assume would be the backup. Niall Davis used to be that guy. Everyone every year drafted Niall Davis. Kristen Michael, another example. I mean, the list goes on and on. People were drafting these handcuffs each and every year, and when the time came for these handcuffs to step up because an injury happened to their starter, nothing happened. Now we'll get into some numbers. The second reason handcuffing is a bad idea is that the chance of having the running back handcuff of the running back who goes down is low. In the article I wrote, I walked through how I defined a handcuff, because defining a handcuff in and of itself is somewhat subjective. Any study like this has its subjectivity, but I try to be logical with it. I looked at the top 12 running backs pre-draft over the last 6 years as being handcuffable. No, handcuffable is not a word, but what I'm basically looking at is all of the RB1s in 12-team leagues that have been drafted over the last 6 years. That gives us a sample of 72 total running backs that could possibly be handcuffed. Among those backs, I found that there were 54 potential handcuffs. Now, how did I get that number? Well, the last hypothetical starter in a 12-team league gets drafted in round 6, generally speaking, meaning a player drafted there would definitely not be a handcuff. So I looked at any back drafted from round 7 onward as a handcuff. That allowed me to be as open-ended as possible, despite the fact that most handcuffs are taken in the double-digit rounds. So we're looking at 54 total handcuffs over the last 6 years. So within this study, I didn't want to just look at how these 54 running backs scored at year's end, because that's not how handcuffs are going to accumulate points. That wouldn't be fair. They're obviously not starters, so their season-long numbers won't look very great. So I looked at top 24 weeks, excluding week 17, because week 17 to fantasy football is as worthless as the D-pad is to a Nintendo 64 controller. Basically, what I'm looking at is RB1 or RB2 performances in a given week by these 54 handcuffs. Just to give you all some context for how many top 24 performances is considered good, in 2016, 10 running backs hit the 10 top 24 performances mark. There were 23 running backs with 7 or more, and 36 of them had at least 5. What that means is an RB3 in fantasy football had 5 plus top 24 weeks. RB3 being RB36 or better. So looking back at those 54 running backs, roughly 22% of them had 5 or more top 24 weeks, meaning about 22% of handcuffs drafted over the last 6 years gave you week-to-week production that equated to an RB3. Moreover, 12% finished as RB2 types, and 3.7% of them, 2 running backs, gave you RB1 production. Those 2 running backs were the aforementioned D'Angelo Williams, and then Michael Bush when he came in for Darren McFadden in 2011. That's it. Here's the thing though, and I'm going to read directly from my article here so I don't miss the point, because this is an important point to make in today's NFL. This is from the article. Among the 12 running backs who pushed forth at least 5 top 24 performances during their handcuff year, again, this is where the 22% number came from, 5 of them produced because of an injury to the top back. The other 7 did work because they were good. An example of this is Fred Jackson in 2013. That season, his teammate CJ Spiller was a top 5 running back pick in fantasy drafts. Jackson, meanwhile, was being selected in the 12th round as the 43rd running back off the board. Spiller only missed 1 game that year, though. He still carried the ball 202 times, only 5 fewer carries than his breakout 2012 campaign, which catapulted his cost to the top of 2013 drafts in the first place. Fred Jackson was able to produce because Fred Jackson was good. The same goes for players like Ryan Matthews and Giovanni Bernard in 2015 and Tevin Coleman in 2016. Did they serve as handcuffs? Sure. Matthews was behind DeMarco Murray on the Eagles' depth chart, Bernard was sitting behind Jeremy Hill on theirs, and last season, Coleman was technically playing behind Devontae Freeman. But guess what? Murray, Hill, and Freeman missed a combined 1 game in their respective seasons. Bernard, Matthews, and Coleman were all relatively decent fantasy assets, despite the fact that the running backs they were handcuffing didn't even miss time. That's all from the article. This is so incredibly important. In today's league, it's conceivable for a running back handcuff, a team's backup running back, to produce more and be a better fantasy asset than a team's actual starter. When I published this article, I was shocked to see how many people responded and would say, well, Derrick Henry's the perfect handcuff because if DeMarco Murray goes down, we definitely know that Henry would be the guy. There's no doubt that that's correct. But Derrick Henry is also being drafted in the 6th round ahead of LeGarrette Blount and Bilal Powell, according to fantasyfootballcalculator.com. I'm not telling you whether or not that's a smart selection. I'm telling you that he's a clear backup for Tennessee, being selected before actual team starters. I didn't write this in the article, but generally speaking, what this notion tells us is that handcuffing shouldn't be looked at as the sole reason you select a running back. It should be an added dimension that a certain running back gives you. Tevin Coleman is a decent enough example of this. I'm not necessarily one to take number 2 backs on their teams, but if I was, Coleman's that guy. Because you know that he'll see some volume in that offense. He'll give you something each week in fantasy football, but he also becomes an RB1 if Devontae Freeman gets hurt. But people aren't drafting Tevin Coleman as insurance for Devontae Freeman. That's not how this works. Remember, point number 2 here, and why drafting handcuffs is bad, is that drafting the running back handcuff to the running back who gets hurt is not an easy task. And as the numbers show, the majority of, quote, handcuffs that do well really aren't handcuffs. They do well because they're good football players. And that brings me to our number 3 reason, and probably the most important one. The chance of these handcuffs producing, even with an injury, is incredibly low. So get this, of those 54 running back handcuffs in this study, 17 of them actually saw their starter teammate get hurt and miss significant time, which I deemed as 3 or more games. Again, that's somewhat subjective, but we have to set these borderline arbitrary parameters somewhere in studies like this. These 17 running backs gave us 105 total weeks where the player was injured. I call them injury weeks because I'm really creative. Among these injury weeks, there were 36 top 24 performances by the handcuffed back. So we're saying, given a starting running back is hurt, a handcuff produces a top 24 performance at a 34.29% rate. For some context, that's barely a better rate than Jalen Richard had last season. What this is basically telling you is that even if a running back gets hurt, if we assume the running back is hurt, the chance that your handcuff gives you a top 24 performance is the same chance 2016 Jalen Richard gives you a top 24 performance. Guys, think about this for a second. A handcuff who becomes a starter is basically Jalen Richard. And it stems back to what I said earlier. We think we know more than we actually do when we're drafting these backs. It wasn't Christine Michael that took over for Marshawn Lynch in 2015. It was Thomas Rawls. Niall Davis didn't take over for Jamal Charles 2 years ago. Mike Goodson didn't step in for Darren McFadden a handful of years back. We think we know more than we actually do. Now, it's true that you can play the educated guessing game and reduce the number of busts within this group, to a degree. What I mean by this is that you can select handcuffs only in super high leverage situations. James Conner in Pittsburgh, Darren McFadden in Dallas, Jonathan Williams in Buffalo. And there's a chance that Conner would be a beast if Le'Veon went down, or that Jonathan Williams takes over as an every down back for Buffalo if LaShawn McCoy were to get hurt. But who knows? What I do know is that we felt that same way about other running backs in the past, and they haven't panned out. It's no guarantee. It's never a guarantee in football and in fantasy football. And that leads me to point number 4 as to why drafting handcuffs isn't efficient. The cost of holding on to an asset is just too great. While you wait for a running back injury to occur, your running back handcuff is sitting on your bench collecting dust. Fantasy football owners don't usually look at something like this as costly, but it is. It's no different than your company holding inventory. It's costly. Having a player on your bench doesn't allow you to be flexible with waiver wire moves. Either that or the handcuff is going to be the first one on the waiver wire, in which case, what's the point in drafting the handcuff in the first place? And that reminds me, by the way, DeAngelo Williams, the best handcuff of this decade, wasn't even owned in the majority of leagues when Le'Veon Bell tore his ACL in 2015. Because the injury had happened halfway through the season, and the folks who drafted Williams had eventually dropped him. Brandon Gadula, one of our writers at Numberfire, highlighted this in his yearly waiver wire running backs piece that he does for Numberfire. The other point to make here about holding on to running backs, you know how 17 of those handcuffs had injuries occur to their starters? Well, the average injury to a starter occurred in week 7.47, meaning between week 7 and 8 on average is when one of those big injuries occurred. Meaning you've got to hold on to those freaking handcuffs for 7 or 8 weeks before they even have a chance to be Jalen Richard. So those are the 4 reasons you don't want to draft a handcuff. Number 1, to recap, We don't always know who the handcuffs will be. Number 2, the chance of getting the handcuff whose starter gets hurt is pretty low. Number 3, the chance of the handcuff being productive when the starter gets hurt is also low, probably because backup running backs are bad in the first place. And lastly, number 4, holding on to that spot on your bench is costly. So which players should you draft then? Literally any player who's unknown. That's my answer. A lot of times the guys who jump up and become something are either rookies like OBJ or unknown entities like Josh Gordon. They're surrounded by ambiguity. Those are the players who give you true upside, not handcuffs. At least not handcuffs who you are actually drafting. And that's the thing. I'm actually all for handcuffing as your season goes on. If it's week 9 or 10 and you've got LaShawn McCoy, get Jonathan Williams off the waiver wire, man. You're not burning through opportunity cost in week 9 or 10 when the majority of breakout waiver wire players have already been claimed. Weeks 1 through 4 are a lot different than weeks 9 through 12 in a fantasy football league. So I'm not against handcuffing per se. I'm totally against drafting handcuffs because there are plenty of more ways to capture true upside, not a floor, during fantasy football drafts. That'll do it for me, guys. Appreciate you listening. Hopefully I was able to convince handcuffing truthers a bit that the strategy is a little bit outdated. As always, please subscribe to this podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts can be subscribed to. Follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB and send me some questions for Friday's mailbag episode either through Twitter or by email at jj@numberfire.com. Talk to you then.